The church bells in Bury St Edmunds ring out amongst the shouts of the outraged crowd. Up on the stockades, the accused victims weep silently as hope leaves them. The man they call the Witchfinder General, Matthew Hopkins, stands before them like a looming shadow. Raising his hands, the bells stopped. With the noose tightening, the crowd let out a sudden gasp, followed by ecstatic cheers as their fellow townsfolk hang. Throughout history, evil grows through ignorance and fear, but most of all, thrives in chaos. Hiding behind their titles of Witchfinders, these men made it their mission to rid the lands of witches, deploying terrifying punishments and dispersing unchecked pain along the way. But just who exactly were these men that exploited this panic? In this video, we are going to explore these twisted public interrogation trials and torture methods, look at the life of the most brutal witchfinder, and uncover just how this practice spread like wildfire. In the 17th century, England was in a time of sweeping chaos and civil war spilling out across the Isles, with societal breakdowns and conflict leading to superstition and paranoia which now reign supreme over the once untouched rural villages and counties. Witch hunts have a long history in Europe, from thousands killed from Basque in northern Spain to Scandinavia, but just to fully explore this phenomenon, we need to go further back in the past. Contrary to popular belief, this wasn't just a mutant offshoot of puritanical Christianity, but has been a practice tracing back to early civilizations. The Mesopotamians called it Mauklu, the ritual of burning, used as a common way to counteract witchcraft, involving the symbolic burning of a witch's effigy. To cast someone as a practitioner of magic who were in league with the devil, or carrying out other supernatural tricks, was a common trope that societies used to bring down women. Ancient Roman chronicles accused and slandered Cleopatra of being a seductive sorceress and a witch, even with extracts of anti-witch laws wrote into Roman legislation condemning magical practices. Perhaps echoes of these attitudes were exported through the Roman Empire to Britain before its emergence with Christianity, abandoning its mystical pagan roots. We even see in ancient China with the Wugu incident during the Han Dynasty, with Emperor Wu's paranoia and suspicion of witchcraft, which led to the arrests, torture and executions of hundreds of people, with the accused culprit being blamed for teaching the Empress witchcraft so she could use it on the Emperor's concubines. This left a legacy in Han Dynasty China that influenced political and legal discourse for many years around the going-ons of witchcraft and black magic. This is a reoccurring pattern that links the establishment power players, who are all more than happy to legitimize anti-witchcraft acts and use its power to condemn, persecute and punish women that the state branded as witches. But did they actually believe this superstition, or was it a convenient, unprovable excuse for removing political enemies? Often in history, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Witch hunting was present in early Middle Ages in England, with the most famous accounts were that of high-level accusations among the elites, often on women in high society, for political purposes, such as removing rivals in the royal court. But even before the witchcraft peak, the state first made witchcraft a capital offence in 1542, introduced by Henry VIII, with the introduction of the first witchcraft laws, which brought the penalty of death for this offence. In the 16th and 17th centuries, witch-finding hit its golden age, and the laws were tightened and made stricter in 1604 under the reign of King James I, who had a personal obsession with witchcraft and the occult. Being the author of books on demonology and commissioning the first English language version of the Bible, named after himself, the King James Bible, it was said he was in awe of, but feared the supernatural, terrified that witches could use their power to conspire and overthrow him. His reputation was so damning that even Shakespeare based his character Macbeth on King James, a character we will come back to explore and unpack in more detail with his own devoted episode soon on the channel. Don't forget to protect yourself against this evil by subscribing to the channel and not missing any future episodes. The king was first inspired by the increasing number of witch hunts coming out of mainland Europe after his soon-to-be wife, Anne of Denmark, who was delayed from not being able to set sail in a ship which was bound for Scotland in order for the pair to wed. Fed up by these delays, he attempted the crossing himself, facing the rough seas and storms, to Denmark. He came to the natural conclusion that this must be the work of witches, obviously, manipulating the weather with dark magic. After finally arriving, he learned more of the Denmark witch trials that were taking place there, and also of the wider witch hunts, such as the German Wurzburg witch trials, which took place in the 30 Years' War, which saw the lands ravished, destroyed, and full of famines. Perfect breeding grounds for the witch hunts to begin. Or no doubt he heard of one of the largest ever accounted witch trials, also taking place in Germany, the witch trials of Trier, that led to the deaths of over 1,000 people, with entire families and even a mayor being executed. Similar to how propaganda spreads online today, there was an increasing number of anti-witchcraft pamphlets being distributed, which were arriving from Europe, feeding the fire into the public consciousness. And with the return of King James from Denmark, it was now England and Scotland's turn to compete in this rising terror. This all contributed towards the foundations of the Witchfinders, who, taking up arms to exploit this growing royal and public sentiment, set out on their cruel hunts. Before we look at the life of one of the most infamous of these Witchfinders, we have to understand how brutal these torture methods actually were, where communities and villages would gather for the show trials and turn on each other, watching the victims, which were often poor, elderly, or women, be humiliated and tortured. The Devil's Mark. It was believed when a witch pledged herself to the devil, they were marked with a sign of their loyalty. This Devil's Mark was in an area of witches' bodies that would not respond to pain. Witchcraft investigators used sharp tools to prick the skin of suspected witches to see if the Devil's Mark could be found. The witch hunters would sell their services themselves to examine suspects, often using retractable blades to fool the crowds into believing the Devil's Mark was actually there. Even birthmarks or a mole on the skin could be enough to accuse a person of being a witch. The rack. The victim's hands and feet were tied to rollers at opposite ends of a wooden frame. Turning the rollers stretched the body, dislocating joints and tearing muscles, to extract confessions or names and accomplices. This was even used in the Tower of London against such famous cases like Guy Fawkes, the scavenger's daughter, a metal device that compressed the body rather than stretched it. The head was forced towards the knees, crushing the body inwards, slowly. This caused extreme pain, internal bleeding, and sometimes even unconsciousness. The manacles. Victims were suspended by their wrists, often with heavy iron manacles, causing dislocating shoulders and intense pain, considered slightly more subtle than the rack, used when full torture wasn't authorised. Pricking. Witch hunters used sharp needles or bodkins to prick the skin to find witch marks, spots supposedly insensitive to pain that didn't bleed. Not all was considered torture, but could be abusive and humiliating in front of a live crowd. Sleep deprivation. Prisoners who were kept awake for days, whilst questioned relentlessly to wear them down mentally. Widely used during witchcraft trials to induce confessions. It was often women who faced the most persecutions, being the targets of the hysteria and hostility. Often healers, midwives, or outspoken women were condemned. Historian Anne Llewellyn Barstow wrote, "For the first time, women were criminalised as a group and hunted out primarily because they were women, a much familiar tactic politicians use in modern times, in which those in power shift blame outwards. Perhaps this was just easier to blame the witches in times of crop failure, economic unrest, and other hardships than take any responsibility for practical solutions, with the underlying theme of witchery acting as an almost symbolic code word for femininity, which is historically treated as a somewhat otherworldly and dangerous mystical force in its own right. Often viewed as a threat to the status quo and feared, we see countless societies suppressing women in history. Perhaps one of the most famous martyrs of this was Joan of Arc, a now mythical figure in which the English and Burgundian lords slandered and sought to discredit her, declaring her a witch for the messages she confessed she received from undead saints in the last-ditched attempts to rally her people and defend France. After considering these many accounts of how witch hunts were deployed by the powerful and those ruling at the top of society, men at the bottom of the ladder were more than happy to profit and get their hands dirty. The most famous of these witch hunters to emerge out the darkness was Matthew Hopkins, AKA the Witchfinder General. Hopkins claimed to possess the ability to identify, capture, and bring justice to witches, declaring that the mark of Satan is upon them. They must hang. Hopkins travelled from town to town, driven by a self-appointed, determined mission to rid the world of witches and their perceived malevolence. It's important to note that none of his methods were technically legal, as he was deemed too radical, even for this time. Being a son of a middle-class Puritan vicar and receiving a Christian education, he was no stranger to the growing church's purges and mistrusting gays in a time of Catholic versus Protestant, neighbour versus neighbour. He devised cruel and merciless methods to extract confessions from the accused. One such method was the horrific swim test, based on the idea that as witches, they had renounced their baptism and water would reject them. Suspects were tied to a chair and thrown into water. All those who swam, which was actually just floating due to being unconscious, were considered to be witches. Hopkins and his assistants subjected countless innocents, again mostly women, to horrific trials, relying on dubious evidence and the power of spreading fear, whilst in the backdrop and cover of the chaotic English Civil War. In the 3 years he hunted witches, more people were executed for practicing witchcraft in England than in the 100 years prior combined. He even had a manifesto called The Discovery of Witches, in which he referenced the idea of spiritual warfare in his own personal crusades. In the pursuit of payment for these services, he became wealthy, being paid from parish to parish. Lives were destroyed, families torn apart, and communities left in turmoil. But as time went on, doubts emerged around the validity of Hopkins' methods and the very existence of the witches that he sought to destroy. With the fear that once gripped the land beginning to fade, and the legacy of the Witchfinder General became a stain on history as his unlawful torture methods for confessions were exposed. We've all heard about the Salem witch trials in America. As a direct result of this mass hysteria, religious extremism, politics, and personal vendettas, which spread to the colonies from the English and Scottish practices. With the same repeating patterns we've looked at so far, on top of the increasing social tensions in a new strange land, with the colonists escaping religious overreach from the church and enduring constant Native American raids, the theme of the backdrop of war festered into the witch-hunting paranoia which led them to turn upon themselves. But one overlooked quiet realm in which one of the most brutal practices took place was the British Channel Islands, in between the UK and France. Witches were often burned alive here, not hanged as they were in mainland England. In these rural isolated island communities, it spread faster due to them lacking any central authority and how they were more at risk with economic hardships such as crop failure or famine, again looking for people to blame. Torture was often far more brutal here too, being legalised locally and used in full force to extract confessions with anyone thought to be practising witchcraft, after which the convicted were flogged, banished, hanged, strangled, or burnt at the stake. One of these victims in Jersey was named Elizabeth Gavey, who wasn't even officially tried as a witch, but was horrifically lynched by a crazed mob. Her body was found discarded on a local road, another example of the accused souls who were socially marginalised and defenceless. These stories serve as a reminder of the dangers of blind zealotry and the importance of seeking truth, being wary of the dangers and hysteria that can fester in war-torn lands with a fractured society. Today, in the 21st century Western society, the distant memories of witch hunts still linger as historic cruelty, but it's not completely out the realm of possibilities to reimagine this as a new form. In a digital world where the truth is often blurred or openly manipulated through lies and mistrust, we must always be vigilant against the dark lurking shadows of ignorance. We see this with reports of modern witch hunts coming out of remote parts of Africa, India, and Papua New Guinea. Let me know in the comments if you would like to see a video investigating the modern witch hunts too. But what do you think of these witch hunts and the witchfinders who hunted them? Once in a blue moon, the truth is revealed. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos,